Hey there guys, we are going to take a look right now. It's yet another deck for my fanfic series. Now this is a deck that was sent along and it is a blue-white, basically a BlinkPost deck. Now this is something that when I'm looking at it, I can see some major problems right away. And as you'll see in the background while I'm talking about this deck, I've included a whole slew of example games for you to take a look at. Now, one of my biggest issues with this deck is that there are so many kind of random 2-of sets. There's stuff like the single prismatic strands. You get double negate, double blink, double compulsive research, double brainstorm. And these aren't necessarily bad card choices, but sometimes you don't need to have so many doubles. You know, if you could cut those down and increase something else. For example, the prismatic strands and the compulsive research. So there's a single prismatic strands and 2 compulsive research. Now, I personally think the strands is something much better suited for the sideboard. That is something that could be taken out, and then you could up the number of compulsive research and increase your draw. Now, I understand that the strands is put in there for a little bit of a main deck advantage because of the fact that you do have mystical teachings. And that's okay. I have always been a fan of kind of the teachings toolbox, as I like to call it, where you run a couple copies of mystical teachings and then a whole bunch of instants to deal with. So, when I'm looking at this list, I had one major card issue. I think out of all the cards, I felt there were a lot of things that were pretty interchangeable as far as card choice goes. Some things maybe not so great, but not so critical, but there was one card out of this whole deck that really stood out the most, and that was this double copy of Brainstorm that you have in here. Now, I'm guessing that you put these in here because of the fact that it is an instant speed draw. You know, you get that category of one blue draw sort spells, Preordain, Ponder, and Brainstorm. And I'm guessing that this was put in there because it is the one that is at instant speed, and you wanted to be able to do that on mystical teachings. And that's all well and good, but if you take a look at any other teachings deck, it's not really going to do that. You are running a full set of preordains in here, and that's fantastic. That's great. That is something that if you look at Is It Post, they do a lot of. I definitely don't think Brainstorm is needed. You know, running 4 preordains in addition to 2 brainstorms mean that you're sitting on a total of 6 1 mana draw spells. And that's all well and good, but you're running a deck that is focused on big mana. I think you could do a lot of better things with those 2 card spots than Brainstorm. I absolutely would take those out in exchange for something else. You know, if you wanted to increase the compulsive research, you could increase the number of Rift Watchers to 3, or not 4. Those would be great. So, in playing this game, playing examples with this deck, now I really, you know, I like to go card by card and offer suggestions and alterations, but I found that this deck had an overall problem. It wasn't so focused on, you know, where if you look at some of the other decks, I'm like, the post deck I showed when I started this series, say, okay, well, I think one of the problems is you have too many of these 1-cost spells that increase your mana. And I could focus on one card, like Abundant Growth, and say, this, I think, is your issue. This deck, I think, is kind of a strategy issue. Now, if you take a look, I'm going to reader have checked out the videos before, and that's how you came to sending me this deck. So if you checked out my attempt at doing my own blue-white post deck, you can see 2 videos. The first one I had done originally, I had attempted to make it more of an aggro aspect. I tried to incorporate level up as an interesting mechanic and try and see how that could work out. After that failed miserably, I rebuilt the deck as more of a blue-white control package, and it was more successful. Now, there's some things you can take from this, and there have actually been a couple blue-white BlinkPost decks that have showed in the dailies that I tried to pull up and look, but I could not find where I had those listed, so unfortunately I couldn't bring them in, but it is a successful mechanic. So if that makes you feel better to start out, the idea of BlinkPost is something that can work and has worked. So you should at least feel good about that. But I learned some major things about doing the blue-white post. At this point in time, I have played more post decks than I care to even consider, and I know where the weaknesses lie. Now, your typical post deck, the idea, especially, Is It Post is the big one we focus on. And the idea is that you're playing things like draw spells, hoping you can find that big finisher in Rolling Thunder. In the meantime, you're going to use a couple of counter spells, maybe 3 Condescend is all you have there. You have a handful of burn spells that will act as creature control. And you will also use things like Glint and just stall for time. Sorry, I feel like I'm losing my voice as I do this. So, you do have a lot of this whole stall for time until you can find a win. Now, this deck, you're doing kind of that same thing. You have a lot of draw spells, which is great. 2 negates, I guess, is going to act as your almost focus for control. And then you have the life gain off of Glimmer Post. So you have those core mechanics, and then you've brought in another mechanic as well. You're trying to use this Stonehorn Dignitary combo. And for those of you who are watching this and may not be as familiar, the Stonehorn Dignitary is a card printed in M12. It is a 1/4 Rhino for 4, and when he enters the battlefield, your opponent skips his next combat phase. So the idea with this is you're running not just Capsize. This deck, you're also running Ghostly Flickers and Momentary Blinks. And that gives you a lot of opportunities to use the Dignitary, but you have to look at the total mana. Now, I understand that the post decks are, they're big on mana. Mana isn't usually an issue. But at the same time, you have to prepare for the early game when you don't have the mana set up yet. If you look at Is It Post, for example, it uses mostly creature control in the form of Lightning Bolt and Flame Slash in order to keep creatures off the board and get the deck to the mid game, which will eventually turn to the late game and win the game. And those 2 spells come in at a single red. They will occasionally bring in stuff like Stagger Shock and whatnot for control, but it's all really early. If you look at, we'll take Stagger Shock as our example. And that is a 3 converted mana cost spell. So that means our highest control option is going to come in at 3 mana. And we're not going to include Capsize in this because that's a whole nother issue. We're going to look at the red burn and the creature control that we have through that. And we're going to look at 3 as our highest level for burn. We have to get at least 3 mana on the board to be able to use our biggest burn spell, which is the Stagger Shock. Okay, so keeping that in mind, look at your deck. Your deck has no control options. You do get Prismatic Strands at 3, which is great, but it's a one-time use, and you're assuming that it's the 1-of card in your deck is in your hand. You can get an additional use off the flashback, but we're only running 5 white creatures, and that makes it very hard to do. A lot of the times, because it's only a single card in your deck, you're going to be trying to tutor for it. And that means instead of it being a simple 3 cost, it's going to cost you at a minimum 7, because you're going to have to pay 4 mana for the Mystical Teachings and then 3 for the Prismatic Strands. If you flash back Mystical Teachings, then it's even worse, because you're going to be paying 9 mana. So your main focus for creature control in this deck is the Dignitaries. This is all well and good, but look at the cheapest you're going to be able to play that Dignitary is for 4. For 4 mana, you are taking the Dignitary from your hand and putting it on the field. That is a one-time activation that is going to skip 1 combat phase. In order to continue to use that same 1 Dignitary that you managed to get on the field, in order to continue to use that ability, you need to use your blink spells. So after the first initial cost of 4 to get it onto the battlefield, it is going to cost you at a minimum of 6 to activate. So you've paid 4 on turn 4, let's say. You've got 4 mana, and now you cannot use that ability again until the next turn, and you can only do that at another 2 mana. So that means you're going to have to set aside 2 mana, and that's hoping you have Momentary Blink. You're going to set aside 2 mana to use the Blink. Okay, you've used that. Now you're going to need additional mana. If you flash it back, it's another 4. If you have another Blink, it's still 2 more. Ghostly Flicker, 3. So in order to get this going, you're not going to be able to get any kind of control going really until turn 4 in an ideal situation. And I say ideal situation because it's not so easy. You have in this deck, you are running 4 Evolving Wilds and 4 Cloud Posts, as well as a single Bog. I like the Bog, that's great. But running the 4 posts and 4 Evolving Wilds means that there's a good chance that you're going to have lands that come into play tapped, and that come turn 4, you're not actually going to have 4 mana available to play that guy. Now, in order to keep him, you've paid for, you've gotten your initial dignitary onto the battlefield, and like I said, you're going to have to continue to pay mana to get that going. You can use Momentary Blink twice. You're running 2 copies, so that's 4. That's great. You have Capsize, but in order to run Capsize plus Dignitary, you're going to need a ton of mana. You're going to need 6 to play Capsize with buyback, and then you're going to pay another 4 to get it back into play, so you're going to need 10 mana to use that specific combination. So you're going to mostly focus on Momentary Blink and Ghostly Flicker to activate this. Now, Ghostly Flicker is great. You can use it 3, but your ideal situation for that is not to simply cast Ghostly Flicker on the Dignitary. Ideally, and you see you've set yourself up for this combo here as well, ideally the Ghostly Flicker is used in conjunction with the Mnemonic Wall so that you can continue to get that single spell back to your hand, and it works as card advantage for you, so you can continue to play Ghostly Flicker until your opponent finds a way to disrupt this. This is great, but now you look at what your setup has to be. Not only do you have to pay 4 to get the initial Dignitary on the field, you have to pay another 5 to get the Mnemonic Wall onto the field. And then in addition to that, you need to have 3 mana to blink both of those 2 cards. Now these don't all have to happen on the same turn, but you just have to understand the heavy mana investment that this is going to cost over the number of turns. And more importantly, you have to consider the fact that you have to have one of the walls in play, and there are only 2 in the deck, so you have to be able to find those and be able to get this going. There is quite a bit of draw, and that's great, but it's not necessarily going to put you in a situation where you find 2 out of 60. If you look at a lot of Is It Pokes decks, and mostly you'll see this combination with Ghostly Flicker and Mnemonic Wall in BlinkPost lists, because it can also use it in conjunction with the Chittering Rats. So if you look at those lists, they're not really relying on that combination to keep the game alive, to act as control. They have other things. They have Agony Warp, they have Doomblade, and these are options for them to control creatures. They come at a much lower cost, and they're not reliant on the wall being in play and having a Ghostly Flicker. You need 3 cards to get that combination going, and 2 of those have to have successfully made it onto the battlefield and stay on the battlefield. Now there are a lot of options for your opponent to kill off creatures. You'll see in one of the example games I play a mono blue control deck that manages to use double serrated arrows to eventually kill off creatures. Stuff like that is very important. If they have a Doomblade and kill off one of those 2 cards, you have no way to get those back from your graveyard. So if the creature is dead, it's dead, and you've just had your combo disrupted. Your entire control package is focused on the idea of blinking Stonehorn Dignitary. It's very not only mana intensive, but it's risky, because the Dignitary's ability says that your target opponent skips his or her next combat phase. This means that it's basically acting as a fog, and I am not a fan of fog effects, and here's why. If I cast fog, my opponent's damage does not happen. Great. That's awesome. I have survived 1 more turn. But unless I have the winning card next turn, or something more substantial, I am just delaying the inevitable. If you look at, most decks, if I can, that's great, but I need to have something to remove that creature. Fogging is going to prevent damage, but it leaves the creature on the field. It's like, okay, fine, skipping a turn, go again. Now your opponent, is going to get another chance. He's going to wait another turn, and there's a chance that he could disrupt this combo. You've prevented the damage for 1 turn, but you've also given your opponent another turn to find an answer to your combo between the wall and the Dignitary. Things like Is It Post and BlinkPost survive because they have the ability to remove creatures on the field. Once creatures get on the field, you're stuck. You're basically going to be relying on Capsize as your only removal. Ghostly your own creatures. So having I'm sorry, I just got a text message to distract me there. Having those focus on blinking the Dignitary is great, but your only option for removing creatures on your opponent's side of the field is the Capsize. So yes, if we eventually find ourselves in the middle to late game where we have the mana available to capsize every turn, great, we can continually remove a creature per turn, increasing up to maybe 2 creatures per turn or 3. But it's going to be the only option. If they find some way to get rid of our capsize, we're screwed. We're going to have to wait until we can find a wall, and hopefully the wall can get that back, and then we can continue to bounce. Meanwhile, our damage is going to be mostly Mulldrifters, which is a 2/2 flyer. The Dignitaries, if you can manage to get through there, it's 1 damage. Excuse me. More times than not, the Mulldrifters and the Rift Watchers. Rift Watchers? Yes, the Rift Watchers are going to be your big damage, and the Rift Watchers do not stay. The Rift Watcher is another thing. It's great to have it in there, but when you're really focusing on the Dignitary, and you want the Dignitary's ability to prevent combat damage and stop damage from happening to you, you're not going to use a momentary blink or a ghostly flicker on something like the Rift Watcher, because if you do, you've just wasted an opportunity to prevent damage for another turn. I think that, I had someone suggest somewhere in the comments on one of my other videos the combination between Capsize and Dignitary, and this is great. And I acknowledged it. I know it's a great combination. There's a lot of potential to it, especially with things like Ghostly Flicker that we got now. But there's a major, major problem. And that problem comes from the fact that it doesn't remove anything, and it really is going to be a lot of mana to get it activated. So my suggestion to you would be this. Instead of running a set of 3 Dignitaries and making it your focus, I would instead cut the Dignitaries back to 1 or maybe 2, and make that kind of a side strategy, have it as a combo for the deck that could be possible if you find yourself in a situation where you can use it, and just not make it the focus for your removal. Things that would be more important would be something maybe like Exile or Oblivion Ring. There were times where I would play against a deck and he would play an artifact like the Longbow, and it would devastate me because I would not be able to remove an artifact. There is no control in this deck. This is a fog mechanic, and that's it with the Dignitary. It prevents damage, but you have no control at all. You have 2 copies of Negate, and that is as far as control in this deck goes. It gives you no options to remove anything from the field permanently. So maybe consider bringing in, I would definitely take out the single copy of Prismatic Strands. I would take out 2 copies of Brainstorm. Dignitaries, if you really like it so much, maybe just cut it back to 2, and that would at least free up 1 extra spot. I think the Mulldrifter could definitely be increased to a 4 of, and the Crusher could be increased to a 4 of. One of the things I found when playing this game is so many times I was dying to find some kind of finisher. I would make it to the mid or late game, and I would have the lockdown with the Dignitary, but I'd have no finisher. This deck, unlike Izzet Post, doesn't get that burn spell. There's no Rolling Thunder or Karavek's Torch, so you had no finisher. Your finisher in this deck most times is going to be the Crusher, and having 3 copies is great, but sometimes I would draw through most of my deck trying to find one, and then my opponent would simply Doomblade that creature. Okay, I've now lost a Crusher, and now I'm going to sit here and continue to waste time off my clock, continue to draw cards out of my deck looking for another Crusher. If they somehow find an answer for all 3 Crushers, it's game over, because odds are, if they can answer 3 Crushers, they can easily handle shutting down 3 Mulldrifters. Again, I'm not even going to count the Rift Watchers, because most games you're going to want to use the blinks on the Dignitaries as opposed to the Rift Watchers. Now, if you decrease the Dignitaries to a secondary strategy where you only have maybe 1 of them, then you can all of a sudden use those blinks for stuff like the Rift Watchers. Maybe increase the Rift Watcher count up to 3, and then you can get a little more use out of those, a little more utility off of some of these blink effects. You want to be able to, even the things like the Mulldrifter that have that nice enter the battlefield and draw card ability, you don't necessarily want to waste a blink spell on it because you're sitting there thinking, I have no removal, my only chance for holding back creatures in this game is going to be the Dignitary. This creates all kinds of there's a lot of aggro decks that are out there currently. Mono white aggro and Stompy, they're really kind of fast, and it's interesting to consider how fast the Pauper actually is. And when you have those creatures that swing hard and fast, you're really in trouble. If you look at stuff like, oh god, I can't even imagine what the matchup against Infect would be like, because if they got the nuts, then they would easily be able to take you out on turn 2 because you can't get a creature into play until turn 4. Maybe if you get a couple of good draws on your Cloud Posts, you can get one in turn 3. Okay, I take that back. You can get the Rift Watcher a little earlier. But even the Rift Watcher, you probably wouldn't be able to get it until turn 3. So you're really kind of a slow deck, and you need to kind of make up for that. And I know that things like actually Delver is a hard match for Izzet Post, and Infect is a hard match for Izzet Post. If they don't get the red, you have to mulligan aggressively, but I diverge. So I know these kind of very popular decks are hard to beat with this kind of deck, and then you bring in stuff that's fast like aggro, goblins, white weenie, soldiers, slivers, any of these quick aggro decks, and you're gonna have trouble there too. It means that your deck is all of a sudden looking unfavorable against most of the decks out there. You can, I guess, find some advantage if you're playing against other post decks because of the fact that you gain additional power off of their posts as well. So I think that the deck really needed more of a finisher. Upping the Crusher count to 4 could do that. If you wanted to actually bring in the Carevex Torch, you have one in the sideboard, and I really think that's kind of a ridiculous place for it. I think, if anything, the Carevex Torch should have been in the main deck, and that single Prismatic Strand should be in the sideboard. It's definitely out of place in the sideboard, and if you have it, that's something that come game 2 I would want to bring in every game because I just didn't have a finisher that I needed. Looking at the rest of your sideboard kind of emphasizes this problem as well. You have a 4th copy of the Dignitary, and again, I think that focuses too much of the deck on this whole Dignitary combo. If you really keep it that heavy, then things like the Rift Watcher aren't as powerful to you because of the fact that it's going to die, and I'm going to want to save my blinks for the Dignitaries. I think the deck is currently a little too reliant on that combo. I mean, it's great. It's a good combination that has the potential to lock out your opponent from dealing damage, but at the same time, you have to be able to do damage to win the game yourself, because your deck draws a lot of cards. You have Preordains, Prisms, you have Compulsive Research, and Mulldrifters. All of these things draw cards. Now, if you're sitting across from someone like Mono White, sure, you can get them locked out with Dignitary, but they'll have stuff in the air to block your Mulldrifters, and you can't get through. And they'll have Unmake for your Crushers, or Journey to Nowhere, so they can shut down your aggro, and all you're doing is locking them out. So the game is going to just waste time. You're going to pass time off the clock. You're going to draw yourself until you lose. There's no way for you to really win that unless you get a good draw. Now, if you bring in something like Carevex Torch instead of that Prismatic Strands, all of a sudden you've given yourself a win in that matchup. You find yourself in a situation, he's removed all your Crushers, he's got blockers for your Drifters, but you have a Carevex Torch, and he has no answer really to that. That's something that you could do. I think another error in this deck is the double negates in the main deck. I think perhaps switching those 2 negates for the 2 prohibits that you have in your sideboard would be a much better advantage there. Negate, we're actually in a pretty heavy creature environment, and a lot of Pauper decks are more reliant on creatures than non-creature spells. So I think having the prohibits in the main deck allows you to attack both fronts. You can attack both creatures and non-creatures. It does have a bit of a drawback on the size of the spell, but hitting something for 4 or less is pretty easy to do. Putting those 2 negates in the sideboard allows you to still bring them in for the matchups where it's important, but I feel like this deck is what it would look like. What I think the deck as it is what a better blue-white post deck would look like in game 2 after sideboarding. Hopefully I said that right. You have, the rest of the stuff is good in the sideboard. The Unholy Lights is great, Echoing Truth is great, but you have absolutely no answer for Affinity, which kind of sucks. Prismatic Strand's not going to work against Affinity. Serrated Arrows could help a little bit, It can definitely give you some good plays against a Tog. I know it's really good there, but there's nothing else. You have probably the most interesting choice of sideboard cards. 2 copies of Cloud of Fairies. I don't get it. Um, the only possible thing I could get is maybe if you were going to use those to untap Cloud Posts, but it's not worth it. There's no way that Cloud of Fairies would be something that I would ever bring in from the sideboard. I think those 2 cards are wasting spots, and you could definitely switch those out. So here's my final suggestion. Hopefully that covered it all pretty well for you, but hopefully let me try and sum this up. I would take the copy of Prismatic Strands, move it to the sideboard in place of Karabek's Torch in the main deck. Now, I would also, personally, I think you're a little too reliant on the dignitaries. So I would probably cut the dignitary back to a single copy. I would then increase Muldrifter to 4 and Rift Watcher to 3. Next thing that would have to go for me would be the 2 Brainstorms. I would take the 2 Brainstorms out, probably increase Compulsive Research by 1, and you could use some Oblivion Rings. So maybe instead of actually increasing Compulsive Research, maybe use those 2 spots that you have available now for 2 Oblivion Rings. Like I said, this deck really needs some kind of removal. It seriously lacks removal. I would also switch the 2 negates for the 2 prohibits in the sideboard. Like I said, I think that gives you a much more diverse array of options for countering. So, God, it's definitely tight. I said we're at 2 Oblivion Rings. I would definitely probably increase that to 3, if not 3. We'll say 3. I would cut back your lands by 1, maybe cut out an Evolving Wilds. As it stands, you've got pretty heavy on the basic lands, pretty heavy on the tapped lands, so I would probably cut an Evolving Wilds for that 3rd Oblivion Ring. For the sideboard, I would definitely cut out the single copy of... actually, no. I will leave the single copy of the Dignitary in the sideboard. You may find yourself in a situation where, against aggro, that it could be necessary. So I would leave that. But I definitely would get rid of the 2 copies of Cloud of Fairies. I'm not sure what you personally would want to bring in. Based on testing, maybe if you found a lot of affinity you were going against, you would want to bring in something like Steel Sabotage. That could work very well for you. There's no real good answer in this deck currently for kind of the mirror matchup. You just have to hope that you can do something better. Maybe take those 2 fairies out, bring in a 3rd Crusher. A 4th Crusher for your sideboard, because that could definitely help you out in that matchup. And I don't know what else. Maybe a 3rd copy of Prismatic Strands. Maybe a 4th copy of Oblivion Ring, something like that. It really, would probably require more testing to decide where the weak matchups were after making some of the changes, perhaps, that I suggested. I mean, it's one of these things too, where if you look at Is It Post or Dimir Post, they run very low creatures, maybe running 11. And that's painful, and it's even, I think, more than 11. I've been messing around here, and having that really kind of sucks, because you've got Mystical Teachings and a very 24 lands, 11 creatures. That means you're pretty light when it comes to things that Teachings can find. Preordain can't be found by Mystical Teachings. Prophetic Prism can't be found by Mystical Teachings. Mystical Teachings actually almost seems like a wasted card spot in this deck. I know it's a pretty typical thing. You're running Compulsive Research, also can't be found. It's great that it can find these blinks for you, but if you switch those 2 Mystical Teachings into perhaps 2 more copies of the Compulsive Research, then maybe you would get yourself... you can no longer tutor the blinks that you need, but you would be able to draw through so much of your deck that you could probably find them. So these are just some things to think about. Some changes you could possibly make. I really think that the problem with this deck is in the the initial just overall thought and approach. I think instead of it being so much focused on comboing the dignitary with the wall and the blinks and whatnot, I think it needs to be focused more on being a blue-white control deck first and foremost. So hopefully some of those thoughts helped. Hopefully you can put these into some good use. And feel free to let me know how it turned out. I did hear back from my last one, that mono white. Dude was very happy with the suggested changes, said it worked out really well for him, so that's great. I'm glad to help you guys. If anyone else wants to, feel free to send me a pauper. I'm going to emphasize pauper because I have gotten a couple deck lists that were not. But if you want to send me your casual pauper list or competitive pauper list and have me take a look, I will be more than happy to add it as one of these fan fixes and make some suggestions that I think could happen. Just make sure to let me know whether the intended purpose is casual or competitive. And, just a little disclaimer here, I am very busy writing articles, putting up videos for other series and whatnot, so if I don't get back to you right away, or if you do not see the video go up right away, don't be discouraged. I have gotten your email, and I will be getting to it as soon as I can. So, there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed this other fanfix, and I will catch you all later.